James Harmon's heart stopped when the military dog tag in the abandoned farm's hidden box bore his dead father's name. But it was the ancient white horse standing beside him, the same animal from 50-year-old photographs that shattered everything he thought he knew about reality. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The mountains had always called to James Harmon. Even during his darkest days in Afghanistan, he would close his eyes and picture the rolling peaks of his childhood home, imagining the crisp air filling his lungs instead of the desert dust. Now, 3 years after his honorable discharge, the mountains were his refuge, a silent witness to his struggle to find peace. The nightmares still came, loud and violent, shaking him from sleep most nights. The doctors called it PTSD. James called it remembering. On this particular morning, James woke before dawn, his heart pounding from dreams he couldn't quite recall. Rather than fighting for more sleep, he laced up his boots, packed his rucksack with essentials, and headed out from the small cabin he'd been renting on the outskirts of Pine Ridge. The mountain trails were his therapy, more effective than any medication the VA had prescribed. The September air was crisp as he hiked up the familiar path, the first hints of autumn, painting the landscape in gold and amber. 2 hours into his hike, as the sun climbed higher in the sky, James paused at a ridge overlooking a small valley he'd never explored before. That's when he first saw the horse. It was grazing in a meadow below, its white coat gleaming like freshly fallen snow against the tall grass. Even from a distance, James could tell it was magnificent, strong, muscular, with a flowing mane that caught the morning light. But what struck him most was that the horse appeared to be alone, with no sign of other horses, fences, or human structures nearby. "Where did you come from?" James whispered, more to himself than to the animal below. Curiosity piqued, he began his descent toward the meadow. As he drew closer, the horse lifted its head, alert to his presence. James expected it to bolt, but instead it stood its ground, watching him with intelligent eyes that seemed to assess his intentions. Years of military training had taught James patience. He stopped about 50 yards away and slowly sat down in the grass, making himself as non-threatening as possible. From his pack, he pulled out an apple he'd packed for lunch and set it on the ground between them. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said softly, his voice rusty from disuse. Living alone in the mountains didn't provide many opportunities for conversation. For nearly an hour, they remained in this standoff. James sitting quietly, occasionally taking sips from his canteen, the horse watching, occasionally returning to graze but never wandering far. Finally, the animal took a few cautious steps toward him. Its movements were graceful but hesitant, as if it was familiar with humans but had reason to be wary. When it was close enough to reach the apple, the horse stretched its neck and delicately took the fruit. As it crunched, James noticed something he hadn't seen from a distance, a thin scar running down its right flank, the hair grown back white against white, almost invisible unless you were looking for signs of past trauma. It was something James recognized all too well. "You've been through something too, haven't you?" he murmured. The horse's ears flicked toward his voice, and for a moment James felt an unexpected connection with this wild creature. Two wounded souls meeting in the wilderness. After finishing the apple, the horse didn't retreat. Instead, it stayed near, close enough that James could see it was a stallion, probably 6 or 7 years old. As the day wore on, James remained in the meadow, and gradually, the horse allowed him to move around, even approaching close enough that James could feel its warm breath on his outstretched hand. "No bridle marks," James observed. "You've never been broken, have you? Or if you were, it was a long time ago." By mid-afternoon, James had earned enough trust to gently touch the horse's neck. The animal tensed but didn't pull away. The coat was rough and tangled, suggesting it had been wild for some time. but the way it responded to human touch indicated it hadn't always been so. "I should head back," James finally said, rising slowly to his feet. To his surprise, when he began walking back toward the trail, the horse followed at a respectful distance. James stopped and turned. "Going my way." The horse nickered softly as if in response. With a shrug, James continued walking and the horse kept pace. They traveled like this for about a mile before James spotted something in the distance, a small stone structure nestled at the base of a forested hillside. It wasn't on any of the trail maps he'd studied, and from its weathered appearance it had been abandoned for years. "What do you think?" he asked the horse, who had stopped alongside him. "Should we check it out?" The structure turned out to be an old farm built perhaps a century ago, when settlers had tried to carve out a living in these unforgiving mountains. The main house was small but solidly constructed from local stone, its roof partially collapsed but its walls still standing firm against the elements. A small barn stood nearby, in worse condition, with one wall completely fallen in. As they approached, the horse grew agitated, tossing its head and snorting. James slowed his pace, scanning the area for any signs of danger, an instinct that had saved his life more than once overseas. But the farm appeared deserted, reclaimed by nature years ago. "Easy," he soothed. "What's got you spooked?" The horse calmed at his voice but remained alert, ears pricked forward toward the stone house. James approached cautiously, years of military training making him check corners and sightlines even in this obviously abandoned place. The door hung askew on rusted hinges, and he had to push it gently to gain entry. Inside, dust motes danced in the beams of sunlight that streamed through holes in the roof. The space was small, a single room with the remnants of a stone fireplace, a broken table, and what might have once been a bed frame, now collapsed and rotted. But it was what was carved into the walls that caught James's attention. Names and dates covered the stone in neat, deliberate rows. Some were accompanied by small symbols, a cross, a star, strange geometric patterns that meant nothing to James. The dates spanned decades, from the early 1900s to as recent as 2010. "What is this place?" James whispered, running his fingers over the engravings. Outside, the horse whinnied, a sound that echoed through the empty structure. James stepped back out into the fading afternoon light to find the animal pawing at the ground near the barn. Curious, he walked over, and the horse moved aside, as if inviting him to look at what it had uncovered. The ground had been disturbed, whether by the horse's hooves or by something else, James couldn't tell, but partially exposed in the dirt was a small metal box. James knelt and carefully extracted it from the soil. It was a military ammunition box, the kind used to store .50 caliber rounds, but it was older than any James had used in his service. The horse nudged his shoulder, nearly causing him to drop the box. Okay, I'm opening it," James said, finding the latch and carefully lifting the lid. Inside, nestled in what looked like decades-old fabric, was a collection of items that made James's breath catch in his throat. Dog tags, dozens of them, from different eras of military service. World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, and more recent conflicts. Among them were small personal effects, a pocket watch, faded photographs, letters sealed in plastic bags to protect them from the elements. James lifted one of the more recent-looking sets of tags and read the name stamped into the metal. Harmon, Michael J. His father's name. James stared at the tag in disbelief, then at the white horse standing patiently beside him, its intelligent eyes seeming to watch for his reaction. The sun was beginning to set behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the abandoned farm, as James tried to make sense of what he had found. "What is this place?" he asked again, his voice barely above a whisper. "And how did you know to bring me here?" James sat heavily on a fallen beam, the metal dog tags cool against his palm. The white horse stood nearby, watching him with those intelligent eyes that seemed to understand more than any animal should. Twilight was settling over the mountains, painting the abandoned farm in shades of purple and blue. James knew he should start heading back to his cabin before darkness made the journey treacherous, but he couldn't tear himself away from what he'd discovered. Michael Harmon had been a career military man, serving 3 tours in Vietnam before James was even born. He died when James was 15, not in combat but from the cancer that many blamed on Agent Orange exposure. James had followed in his footsteps, joining the Army straight out of high school, seeking the discipline and purpose his father had embodied. But what was his father's dog tag doing here in this forgotten place? Michael had never mentioned any connection to these mountains. As far as James knew, his father had grown up in Ohio, met his mother in Texas during training, and had been stationed at bases across the country and abroad. Never here. "Did you know him?" James asked the horse, feeling slightly foolish for talking to an animal, yet somehow comforted by its steady presence. The horse nickered softly and pawed at the ground again, this time near the ammunition box. James reached back into the container, carefully examining the other tags. Some dated back to World War I. The information stamped into them faded but still legible. Others were newer, including a few that used the modern tag design with the embedded microchip that had been standard during James's own service. Beneath the dog tags were the photographs, black and white snapshots of stern-faced young men in various military uniforms, standing in front of this very stone house before time and weather had taken their toll. One particular photo caught his eye, a group of men, perhaps 20 in total, standing in a semicircle. In the background, partially visible, was a white horse. "Impossible," James whispered, looking up at the animal beside him. The horse in the photo would be long dead. The picture had to be at least 50 years old, judging by the uniforms and the sepia tone of the paper. Yet the resemblance was uncanny. The same proud head, the same powerful build. Even what appeared to be a scar on its flank, though the photo quality made it difficult to be certain. The daylight was fading quickly now. James carefully repacked the box, tucking his father's dog tag into his shirt pocket. He would need to return in the morning with proper supplies to document everything and perhaps start piecing together this mystery. "I need to go back," he said to the horse, "but I'll return tomorrow. Will you be here?" The horse tossed its mane as if in affirmation. James smiled despite himself. 3 years of therapy hadn't managed what a few hours with this animal had accomplished. He felt a sense of purpose again, a curiosity about the world that had been absent since his discharge. The journey back to his cabin was more difficult than anticipated. Darkness fell quickly in the mountains, and though James had a small flashlight, the beam seemed feeble against the encompassing night. Several times he lost the trail, only to find the white horse mysteriously appearing ahead of him, its pale coat visible even in the dim light, guiding him back to the correct path. By the time James reached his cabin, it was well past midnight. Exhaustion pulled at his limbs, but his mind was racing with questions. He lit the wood stove, made a pot of strong coffee, and spread the contents of his father's military file on the small kitchen table. Michael Harmon's service record was exemplary: multiple commendations, rapid promotions, specialized training in reconnaissance and survival. But there was nothing to indicate any connection to this remote mountain region. The last posting before his retirement had been Fort Bragg, nearly 500 miles away. James pulled out his laptop, grateful for the satellite internet he'd splurged on despite his limited budget. He began searching for information about the area, looking for any mention of military activity in these mountains. After several hours, his eyes burning from staring at the screen, he found a single reference in a local historical society's digital archives. The article, dated 1967, mentioned a mountain training facility established during the early Cold War years, where specialized units trained in alpine warfare and survival techniques. The facility was reportedly decommissioned in 1972, its existence virtually erased from military records as part of the post-Vietnam downsizing. The location wasn't specified, but a grainy accompanying photograph showed a stone structure that looked remarkably similar to the abandoned farm James had discovered. He checked the dates against his father's service record. Michael Harmon had an unexplained 6-month gap in his documented assignments during 1969, listed only as specialized training, classified. James rubbed his tired eyes. Could his father have trained at this facility? Was that why his dog tag had been there? But that didn't explain the other tags spanning decades of service or why they'd been collected and hidden in an ammunition box. Outside, a soft nickering broke the pre-dawn silence. James went to the window and was startled to see the white horse standing in his yard, illuminated by the porch light, calm and patient, as if it had been waiting there all night. "How did you find me?" James whispered through the glass. The horse lifted its head, looking directly at the cabin as if it could see James through the window. Then it turned and began walking slowly back toward the trail, stopping after a few yards to look back at him. The message seemed clear: "Follow me." James hesitated only briefly. He'd managed perhaps 2 hours of fitful sleep, but adrenaline and curiosity were stronger than fatigue. He quickly packed his rucksack with supplies for a longer stay: extra food, a first aid kit, his camera, notebooks, and a small entrenching tool that might be useful for further excavation. As he stepped outside, the cool morning air brushed his face, carrying the scent of pine and something else, a faint metallic tang that reminded him of the battlefield. The horse waited patiently as James locked his cabin and checked his pack one last time. "All right," he said. "Show me what you want me to see." The horse set off at a steady walk, occasionally looking back to ensure James was following. They didn't take the same trail as the previous day. Instead, the horse led him through a series of ravines and narrow passes that James would never have discovered on his own, a more direct route to the abandoned farm. As they crested the final ridge and the stone house came into view, James saw something that made him drop to a crouch instinctively, his combat training kicking in. There was movement around the farm, human figures examining the building and the surrounding area. And parked on the crude dirt track that must have once served as a road was a black SUV with government plates. James's heart hammered in his chest as he observed the scene below. 3 men in dark clothing were methodically examining the stone house, one taking photographs while another appeared to be measuring the dimensions of the structure. The third, a tall man with silver hair, stood slightly apart, supervising the operation with the authoritative stance of someone accustomed to command. Beside him, the white horse remained unnaturally still, as if it too understood the need for caution. James wondered briefly if he was being paranoid. Perhaps these were just historians or archaeologists with legitimate permission to be here. But something about their efficient movements and the government plates on the vehicle triggered his instincts. "We need to stay out of sight," James whispered to the horse, feeling only slightly ridiculous for speaking to an animal as a confidant. But the horse seemed to understand, following James as he retreated behind the ridgeline, circling around to approach the farm from the densely forested eastern slope where they would have better cover. As they moved carefully through the trees, James considered his options. He could simply walk down and introduce himself, explain his discovery of his father's dog tag. That would be the reasonable approach. But years in combat had taught him that information was power, and revealing what he knew before understanding the situation could be a tactical error. They reached a position where they could observe the farm while remaining hidden among the pines. James removed his compact binoculars from his pack and studied the men more carefully. They weren't wearing uniforms. but their bearing and coordinated movements suggested military or intelligence training. The silver-haired leader was now examining something he held in his hand. With a jolt, James realized it was the ammunition box he'd found the previous day. "Damn," he muttered. "They know it's been disturbed." The horse nickered softly, drawing a sharp look from James. To his relief, the men below didn't seem to have heard. The silver-haired man was speaking now, gesturing toward the disturbed earth where James had found the box. One of the others nodded and returned to the SUV, removing what looked like ground-penetrating radar equipment. They were searching for something more. James settled in to watch, the horse grazing quietly nearby, occasionally raising its head to observe the activity below. After about an hour, a second vehicle arrived, a military Humvee with 2 additional personnel, these openly wearing Army uniforms. They conferred briefly with the silver-haired man before unloading more equipment. The operation was expanding. Whatever was happening at this abandoned farm, it clearly warranted significant government interest. As the morning progressed, James witnessed the methodical search of the property. The ground-penetrating radar was employed in a grid pattern around the house and barn. At one point, there was obvious excitement as the operators clustered around a particular spot near the collapsed wall of the barn. The silver-haired man examined their findings, then directed the uniformed soldiers to begin digging. James strained to see what they were uncovering, but couldn't get a clear view from his position. He considered moving closer, but decided the risk of discovery was too great. Instead, he documented everything with his camera, using the telephoto lens to capture details of the operation and the faces of those involved. The white horse had grown restless, pacing behind him in the cover of the trees. When James turned to quiet it, he noticed the animal was staring not at the farm, but at something further up the mountainside. Following its gaze, James spotted what appeared to be the entrance to a mine shaft or tunnel, partially obscured by decades of vegetative growth. "Is that what you want to show me?" James whispered. The horse tossed its head in what James could only interpret as affirmation. Checking once more to ensure the men below were still focused on their excavation, James followed the horse as it picked its way up the slope toward the opening. The entrance was smaller than it had appeared from a distance, barely tall enough for James to enter without stooping. Years of erosion had partially collapsed the opening, but inside, the passage appeared surprisingly well preserved. Mining timber supports, weathered but intact, lined a tunnel that extended into darkness. James hesitated at the threshold. He had a flashlight, but entering an unknown tunnel alone was risky. Cave-ins, bad air, wildlife, any number of dangers could await inside. The horse, as if sensing his hesitation, nudged him gently from behind. Okay, James muttered, "but you're not fitting in there, so I'm on my own." To his surprise, the horse remained at the entrance, as if standing guard. James switched on his flashlight and entered the tunnel, the beam illuminating a passage that sloped gently downward. The air was cool but not stale, suggesting some form of ventilation existed. About 50 feet in, the tunnel widened into a small chamber. What James saw there stopped him in his tracks. This was no mine shaft. The walls were lined with metal filing cabinets, most rusted with age, but some still relatively intact. A military-style desk stood in one corner, a faded map of Southeast Asia still pinned to the wall above it. In another corner, radio equipment, ancient by modern standards, sat silent and dust-covered. This was a command post, James whispered to himself, sweeping his flashlight around the chamber. He approached one of the less deteriorated filing cabinets and attempted to open a drawer. It was locked, but years of exposure to the mountain's humidity had weakened the metal. With a firm pull, the lock mechanism gave way, revealing folders filled with papers. James selected one at random and opened it. Inside was a personnel file, complete with a black and white photograph of a serious-looking young man in an army uniform. The name on the file read Wilson Robert J. and was stamped with the words Mountain Echo Program across the top. Quickly, James checked several more files. Each contained similar information: service records, training evaluations, medical data. One folder was thicker than the others, labeled Program Overview. James opened it with trembling hands, scanning the first page. Mountain Echo, specialized training for long-range reconnaissance and resistance operations behind enemy lines, 1952-1972. Classification, top secret. Further down the page, a paragraph caught his eye. Program participants are selected based on exceptional physical endurance, psychological resilience, and specialized skill sets. Training includes extended isolation periods, extreme environmental conditioning, enhanced communication techniques, and animal partnership protocols. Animal partnership protocols. James's mind immediately went to the white horse waiting outside. A sudden noise from the tunnel entrance snapped James back to the present. The horse was neighing loudly, pawing at the ground. A warning. Quickly, James photographed as many documents as he could, including the program overview and several personnel files. He was about to leave when a name on one of the folders caught his eye. Harmon, Michael J. His father's file. With no time to examine it there, James shoved the entire folder into his pack. Then, guided by the increasingly urgent sounds from the horse, he hurried back up the tunnel toward the entrance. He emerged into daylight just in time to see the white horse backing away from the opening, its eyes fixed on something down the slope. Following its gaze, James saw one of the uniformed soldiers making his way up the hillside, clearly having spotted something that attracted his attention. James ducked back into the tunnel entrance, heart pounding as he pressed himself against the rocky wall. The soldier was moving with purpose, following what appeared to be old boot prints in the soft earth. James's own tracks from earlier. He cursed himself for not being more careful. 3 tours in hostile territory, and he'd made a rookie mistake. Outside, the white horse had disappeared from view. James hoped it had retreated into the trees rather than being spotted. The animal had become his unlikely ally in this increasingly bizarre situation, and he found himself worried for its safety. The soldier's footsteps grew closer, accompanied by the crackle of a radio. "Sir, I've found what looks like a secondary entrance on the eastern slope. Recent tracks leading inside." A voice responded, too distant for James to make out the words clearly, but the soldier's reply was unmistakable. "Yes, sir," proceeding with caution. James assessed his options rapidly. The tunnel behind him might extend further into the mountain, possibly offering an alternative exit, but exploring unknown passages with someone in pursuit was risky. Fighting was a last resort. He had no weapons, and engaging a U.S. soldier would cross a line he wasn't prepared to cross. That left only one viable option: surrender and try to talk his way out of the situation, but the classified documents in his pack complicated matters. If these men were here to secure the site and recover lost intelligence, they wouldn't take kindly to a civilian in possession of top-secret information. The footsteps stopped just outside the entrance. James could hear the soldiers breathing, the subtle sound of a weapon being readied. He prepared himself to step forward, hands raised, when a loud whinny echoed from further down the slope, followed by the unmistakable sound of branches breaking. "Movement to the south," the soldier reported into his radio. "Investigating." The footsteps retreated. James exhaled slowly, hardly daring to believe his luck. Had the horse deliberately created a diversion? The thought seemed ridiculous. Yet everything about this animal had defied normal explanation. Not wasting the opportunity, James slipped out of the tunnel, staying low and moving quickly through the underbrush in the opposite direction from where the soldier had gone. He needed to put distance between himself and the government team, find a secure location to examine his father's file, and figure out what the hell was happening. For the next hour, James made his way through the dense forest, using every evasion technique he'd learned in the military. He crossed a shallow stream several times to break his trail, kept to rocky outcroppings when possible, and maintained awareness of wind direction to stay downwind of any potential pursuit. The physical exertion helped clear his mind, focusing his thoughts on immediate survival rather than the swirling questions about his father and the mysterious Mountain Echo program. Eventually, he reached a small clearing bordered by a rock formation that offered both shelter and a defensible position with good sight lines. James allowed himself to rest, taking careful sips from his canteen as he scanned the forest for any signs of pursuit. Finding none, he finally turned his attention to his father's file. The folder was labeled Harmon Michael J. Echo Subject 37. Inside was a detailed personnel record, much of it information James already knew: date of birth, enlistment details, prior postings. But interspersed were evaluations and reports relating to the Mountain Echo program, dated 1969, during that mysterious 6-month gap in his official service record. Subject 37 demonstrates exceptional aptitude for extended isolation training, read one report. Psychological evaluation indicates above-average resilience to sensory deprivation and stress factors, recommended for Phase 2. Another document dated 3 weeks later described remarkable progress in nonverbal communication protocols and heightened sensitivity to environmental stimuli. The clinical language couldn't disguise what seemed to be described: enhanced sensory abilities beyond normal human capacity. Then James found a photograph that made his blood run cold. It showed his father, much younger but unmistakable, standing beside a white horse, the same white horse that had led James to the farm, to the tunnel, to this very moment. The same distinctive scar was visible on its flank. But that was impossible. The photograph was dated April 1969, over 50 years ago. No horse lived that long, yet the evidence was before his eyes, the resemblance too perfect to be coincidence. Was it a descendant? The same bloodline, perhaps? But that wouldn't explain how it had found James, led him specifically to his father's dog tag, to the hidden command post. Further in the file, he found a section titled Psychic Bonding Experiment Results. The language became more technical, filled with terms like enhanced empathic resonance and cross-species neural synchronization. One paragraph stood out starkly. Subject 37's connection with equine asset Echo 1 has progressed beyond all previous program participants. They have demonstrated consistent success in non-visual tracking exercises at distances exceeding 5 miles, and the subject reports knowing the animal's emotional state without observable cues. Most remarkably, during Separation Test Delta, the equine independently located Subject 37 after being transported 50 miles from the training facility, navigating complex terrain without guidance. James sat back against the rock, mind reeling. The government had been experimenting with some kind of psychic connection between soldiers and animals, horses specifically, and his father had been part of it. Not just part of it, but apparently one of their most successful subjects. The final pages of the file contained medical data and what appeared to be termination paperwork, dated September 1969. Despite exceptional results, Subject 37 has been removed from the program following concerning developments during Phase 3 trials. Subject reports increasingly vivid, shared consciousness episodes with equine asset Echo 1, including access to geographical memories predating their partnership. Medical team unable to identify physiological cause. Recommend immediate program suspension and subject debriefing. Equine asset Echo 1 to be relocated to Facility Omega for continued observation. A handwritten note at the bottom of the page, in different handwriting. Subject 37, attempted unauthorized access to Echo 1 holding facility. Security protocols implemented. Subject restrained and administered memory suppression protocol as per Directive 255. Released to regular service with monitoring. Asset Echo 1 status, contained. They had experimented on his father, achieved some kind of unprecedented success, then erased his memories when he tried to reconnect with the horse he'd bonded with. James felt a surge of anger, not just at the violation of his father's mind, but at the casual clinical language that reduced both man and animal to subjects and assets. A soft nickering drew James's attention. At the edge of the clearing stood the white horse, Echo 1 according to the file, watching him with those intelligent eyes. It showed no signs of having been pursued or injured, and moved toward him with the same deliberate grace it had displayed from their first meeting. Echo 1, James said softly. The horse's ears pricked forward at the name, confirming what seemed impossible. How are you still alive after all this time? The horse approached until it stood directly before him, then lowered its head to gently touch James's chest, right above his heart. The gesture seemed deliberate, meaningful, though James couldn't begin to interpret it. A twig snapped in the forest behind them. The horse's head jerked up, alert to the danger, before James had fully registered the sound. Someone was approaching. James quickly gathered the scattered documents, stuffing them back into his pack. The horse, Echo 1, nudged him urgently toward the eastern edge of the clearing, away from the approaching footsteps. Without hesitation, James followed, staying low and moving as quietly as possible through the underbrush. The white horse navigated the dense forest with surprising agility for its size, choosing paths that accommodated both its bulk and James's need for concealment. They moved downhill, away from the abandoned farm and the government team, but not in the direction of James's cabin. The horse seemed to have a specific destination in mind. After 20 minutes of tense travel, they emerged at the edge of a small, hidden valley. A stream cut through its center, and nestled against the far slope was another structure, not stone like the farm, but a weathered wooden cabin nearly swallowed by encroaching vegetation. Without the horse's guidance, James would never have found this place. Echo 1 stopped at the tree line, ears pricked forward, listening intently before proceeding. James mirrored the animal's caution, scanning the valley for any signs of human presence. Finding none, they approached the cabin together. The door hung askew on rusted hinges, much like the farmhouse they'd left behind. James entered cautiously, the floorboards creaking beneath his weight. The interior was a single room, long abandoned but remarkably preserved by the dry mountain air. A military cot stood against one wall, a simple wooden table and chair in the center, and a pot-bellied stove in the corner. What caught James's attention, however, were the walls. Every available surface was covered with photographs, maps, and handwritten notes, connected by red string in an elaborate web that spoke of obsession and desperate determination. Most of the photos showed the white horse, Echo 1, at different locations around the mountain. Others showed military personnel, including several of the silver-haired man James had observed at the farm, though decades younger, and there, at the center of it all, was a photograph of his father, not the young soldier from the personnel file, but an older Michael Harmon, perhaps in his 50s, with the same white horse beside him. He remembered, James whispered, approaching the wall. They wiped his memories, but he remembered somehow. Echo 1 nickered softly from the doorway, unable to enter the cabin, but watching James intently. The impossible horse that had somehow lived for over 50 years, that had partnered with his father in classified experiments, and had now found Michael Harmon's son. James turned his attention to the handwritten notes. His father's handwriting, which he recognized from childhood birthday cards and rare letters sent from overseas deployments. The notes documented Michael's gradual recovery of his memories, beginning in 1985. Dreams again last night, white horse in mountains, feeling of connection, purpose. Same dream for 3 months now. Another dated 1987. Found reference to Mountain Echo in classified archives during Pentagon assignment. Restricted access. Something about psychic experimentation, animal partnerships. Requested transfer to Fort Bragg Historical Division for further research. The notes became more detailed, more urgent, as the years progressed. Michael had pieced together fragments of his erased memories, following breadcrumbs that led him back to these mountains. He had found Echo 1 again, somehow still alive, still waiting. The final entry, dated 2010, sent a chill down James's spine. Carlson's team discovered my research, claimed national security violation, threatened court-martial if I didn't cease investigation. They don't understand. The connection never broke. Echo 1 has been waiting all these years. What they created can't be undone by their memory protocols. I've secured evidence in the ammunition box at the original training site. If anything happens to me, the truth will remain. Echo 1 will find someone who can understand. James stared at the date, 2010, the year before his father's cancer diagnosis. Had the stress of renewed government interest in his activities contributed to his illness, or was there something more sinister at work? Carlson, James muttered, the name tugging at his memory. Then it clicked. Colonel William Carlson, the silver-haired man leading the team at the farm. He hadn't recognized him at first, but James had met him at his father's funeral, a stern-faced officer who had spoken briefly about Michael's distinguished service to his country. The pieces were falling into place. Carlson must have resumed the search after Michael's death, perhaps believing that whatever secrets Michael had discovered had died with him. Until James had accidentally stumbled upon the ammunition box, alerting them that someone else was now involved. Echo 1 whinnied sharply from outside, a clear warning. Seconds later, James heard the distant sound of vehicle engines. The government team was on the move, and somehow the horse knew they were headed in this direction. James quickly photographed the wall with his phone, capturing as much of his father's research as possible. Then, on impulse, he removed the photo of his father with Echo 1 and tucked it into his pocket. As he turned to leave, something caught his eye. A loose floorboard beneath the table, slightly raised above the others. Kneeling, James pried it up to reveal a small hiding space. Inside was a leather-bound journal and a USB drive sealed in a waterproof container. He grabbed both, adding them to his pack, then replaced the floorboard and hurried outside. Echo 1 was already moving toward the eastern edge of the valley, clearly indicating their escape route. James followed, glancing back only once at the hidden cabin that contained the physical evidence of his father's decades-long quest for truth. They climbed steadily for the next hour, the horse choosing paths that would be difficult for vehicles to follow. James's military training served him well, maintaining a pace that balanced speed with stealth, but he marveled at the horse's endurance. Echo 1 moved with the vigor of an animal in its prime, showing no signs of the advanced age the document suggested. When they finally stopped to rest on a rocky outcropping with a view of the valleys below, James could see dust clouds rising from dirt roads in the distance. The government team's vehicles, methodically searching the area. They were conducting a grid search, and it would only be a matter of time before they discovered the hidden cabin. James took the opportunity to examine the journal he'd recovered. It was his father's personal account of his reconnection with Echo 1, more detailed and intimate than the wall notes. One passage made James's breath catch. The bond never truly broke. Even with my memories suppressed, I felt a presence at the edges of my consciousness for years, a shared awareness I couldn't explain. When we finally found each other again in these mountains, Echo 1 knew me instantly. What Carlson and his scientists don't understand is that they didn't create this connection, they only discovered it. And what they discovered terrifies them, because it suggests human consciousness is far more complex and expansive than their materialist worldview allows. Another entry, near the end of the journal. Echo 1 doesn't age like normal horses. The scientists noted this anomaly in their reports but could never explain it. Some believed the psychic bonding process somehow affected the animal's cellular regeneration. Others theorized that what appears to be a single horse might actually be successive generations, each inheriting the memories and behaviors of its predecessor through some unknown biological mechanism. I know the truth is simpler and more profound. Echo One is an embodiment of something timeless, a living bridge between minds across generations. When I'm gone, the connection will remain. Echo One will find my son. James looked up from the journal to find the white horse watching him, those intelligent eyes seeming to confirm the written words. Echo One had found him, just as his father predicted, not by chance but by design, the continuation of a bond that had begun half a century ago. The sound of a helicopter broke the mountain silence, its rhythmic thudding growing louder as it approached from the south. James closed the journal and scanned the sky, spotting the aircraft as it crested a distant ridge. A black Bell UH-1, no markings visible from this distance. The search had escalated. "They're really pulling out all the stops for this," James muttered. "What the hell did you and my father discover that's got them so spooked after all these years?" Echo One pawed at the ground impatiently, clearly agitated by the helicopter's presence. James understood the urgency. They needed to find better cover. The rocky outcropping provided a good vantage point but left them exposed to aerial observation. "All right, where to next?" James asked, securing his pack. The horse immediately set off toward a densely forested section of the mountain, moving with purpose. James followed, grateful for the thick canopy that would shield them from overhead surveillance. As they traveled, James's mind raced through everything he'd learned. The Mountain Echo program had achieved something unprecedented, a form of interspecies psychic connection that transcended normal understanding of consciousness. His father had been their most successful subject, forming a bond with Echo One so profound that even memory suppression couldn't fully erase it. And now, somehow, that same connection was extending to him. James could feel it growing stronger with each passing hour, a subtle awareness of the horse's emotional state, occasional flashes of perception that didn't come from his own senses. It wasn't mind-reading or anything so dramatic, more like an intuitive understanding that bypassed normal communication. When Echo One wanted to indicate direction or warn of danger, James found himself responding before fully processing why. They continued through the afternoon, maintaining a pace that would be difficult for ground vehicles to match in the rugged terrain. The helicopter made several passes over the general area, but didn't seem to have pinpointed their location. Still, James knew better than to underestimate the resources available to a classified government operation. If thermal imaging or other advanced surveillance was being employed, their advantage wouldn't last long. As dusk approached, Echo One led them to a narrow ravine cut deep into the mountainside. At its end, partially hidden by a natural formation of boulders, was the entrance to a cave. The horse stopped, indicating they should take shelter there. James approached cautiously, using his flashlight to check for signs of wildlife or instability. The entrance widened into a spacious cavern that extended deep into the mountain. The floor was surprisingly level, and along one wall, James discovered evidence of human habitation: an old campfire ring, rusted food tins, and what appeared to be makeshift sleeping arrangements. "Someone lived here," James said, examining the items. "Recently." Echo One remained at the entrance, keeping watch. James ventured further into the cave, his flashlight revealing more signs of extended occupation. In a natural alcove, he found a metal footlocker, military issue but with identifying markings removed. It was locked, but the mechanism was simple enough for James to pick using a multi-tool from his pack. Inside were survival supplies, preserved food, first aid equipment, ammunition for firearms not present, and, most valuably, a solar-powered battery charger with multiple adapters. One would fit the USB drive from his father's cabin. James set up a small camp, rationing his remaining food and using the survival supplies to augment his provisions. Echo 1 eventually joined him, seeming satisfied that they weren't being immediately pursued. The horse's presence in the confined space should have felt awkward or intrusive, but instead conveyed a sense of security and companionship that James found oddly comforting. With the immediate threat of discovery temporarily abated, James connected the USB drive to his phone using the adapter from the footlocker. The drive contained hundreds of files, scanned documents, photographs, audio recordings, and video files, all meticulously organized into folders labeled by year. His father had compiled a comprehensive archive of the Mountain Echo program, far beyond the limited information in the personnel files. James opened a video file dated 2008, and his father's face appeared on the small screen. Michael Harmon looked older than James remembered him, his features gaunt from the early stages of the cancer that would eventually claim him. But his eyes burned with the same intensity James had witnessed during his childhood lessons on discipline and duty. "If you're watching this," Michael began, "then you found Echo 1, and more importantly, Echo 1 has found you. I don't know who you are, perhaps a journalist investigating government black projects, maybe a former program participant whose memories have begun to resurface, or, if there's any justice in this world, my son James." James felt a jolt at hearing his name. His father had made this recording specifically anticipating he might find it. The Mountain Echo program began in 1952 as an attempt to create undetectable communication channels for agents operating behind enemy lines. The initial concept was simple: train soldiers to form empathic bonds with animals that could carry messages or serve as reconnaissance. But what they discovered went far beyond their original intentions. Michael paused, taking a labored breath before continuing. The scientists found that certain individuals could form connections with animals, particularly horses, that transcended normal training relationships. These connections operated on a level they couldn't fully explain with the technology and understanding of the time. They called it psychic bonding, but that term doesn't capture the reality. Echo 1 moved closer to James as the recording continued, the horse's attention fixed on the small screen displaying Michael's face, as if recognizing him despite the years that had passed. What they discovered through the program was that consciousness isn't confined to the human brain. It can extend, merge, and connect across species in ways that challenge our fundamental understanding of what it means to be sentient. Echo 1 isn't just a highly trained animal. He's a participant in a shared awareness that spans decades. Michael's expression became more grave. This is why Carlson and his team have never stopped monitoring the program participants and assets, even decades after official termination. What we discovered threatens the entire materialist paradigm that underpins modern science, and by extension, government control systems. If consciousness can extend beyond the individual, if it can transcend not just personal boundaries but species boundaries, then the implications are... The video cut off abruptly. James checked the file, finding it was incomplete. He searched for a continuation but found nothing with the same date. Whether his father had been interrupted while recording or the file had become corrupted, the rest of the message was lost. James lowered his phone, processing what he'd heard. Echo 1 nudged his arm gently, those intelligent eyes meeting his with what seemed like understanding. The connection his father had described, James could feel it growing stronger. A subtle awareness at the edges of his consciousness that hadn't been there before meeting this remarkable animal. "Is that why they're so determined to find us?" James asked softly, reaching up to stroke the horse's neck. "Because what you represent challenges their whole worldview." From outside the cave came the distant sound of vehicles navigating the rough mountain roads. The government team was still searching, methodically covering the territory, drawing ever closer to their hiding place. James knew they couldn't remain in the cave indefinitely. Eventually, they would need to move again, find a way to either confront Carlson or escape the mountains entirely. James spent the night in the cave, periodically checking the surrounding area for signs of pursuit. The distant lights of vehicles moved across the lower slopes like fireflies, but none approached their hidden sanctuary. Echo One dozed, standing up near the entrance, occasionally lifting his head at sounds imperceptible to James, then settling again when the threat passed. Unable to sleep, James continued exploring his father's digital archive. The files revealed decades of meticulous research, not just into the Mountain Echo program, but into similar government projects investigating the outer edges of human consciousness. There were references to remote viewing experiments, telepathy studies, and even attempts to use quantum entanglement theories to explain the observed phenomena between bonded subjects and animals. In a folder labeled Scientific Theories, James found a document written by his father that attempted to explain Echo One's unusual longevity. The conventional understanding of aging involves cellular degradation over time, primarily through DNA damage and telomere shortening. However, emerging research suggests consciousness itself may play a role in these processes. The mind-body connection has been demonstrated repeatedly in studies of meditation, where practitioners show measurable changes in cellular stress markers and immune function. My hypothesis is that the psychic bonding process fundamentally altered Echo One's relationship to time and cellular aging. The shared consciousness established between us created a feedback loop that somehow stabilized cellular degradation. The scientists noted that all animals in the program showed extended lifespans, but Echo One's case was unprecedented. Blood samples taken in 2005 showed cellular markers consistent with a horse no more than 10 years old, despite being 36 at the time of testing. James glanced at Echo One, trying to reconcile the impossibility of the animal's age with the evidence before him. The white horse showed no signs of the arthritis, muscle loss, or dental wear that would be expected in an elderly equine. If anything, he appeared to be in his prime. Another file, an audio recording from 2009, captured a conversation between Michael Harmon and someone identified only as Dr. Levine, apparently a former scientist from the program who had agreed to speak with Michael off the record. "The bond you formed with Echo One was unique, Michael," Levine's voice explained. "We had other successful pairings, but nothing approaching your level of integration. The neural coherence readings were off the charts. It was as if your brainwave patterns would synchronize even when separated by miles. And you believe this connection could be passed down?" Michael's voice asked. "Theoretically, yes. We observed what we called ancestry effects in other subjects. Second-generation participants showed heightened receptivity to the process, especially with the same animal partners their parents had bonded with. It's as if the neural pathways were somehow pre-established. So my son could potentially form an even stronger connection with Echo One than you did?" "Yes. That's precisely why Carlson has never stopped monitoring your family. The implications are profound." The recording ended there, leaving James with a new understanding of why he'd been drawn to these mountains after his discharge, why Echo One had sought him out specifically. The connection hadn't just been his father's. It had been waiting for him, dormant in his own consciousness until proximity activated it. As dawn approached, James felt a subtle shift in Echo One's demeanor. The horse became alert, moving to the cave entrance and looking expectantly toward the east. James followed, watching as the first rays of sunlight crested the distant ridgeline. Echo One nickered softly, seemingly in response to something beyond James's perception. "What is it?" James whispered, straining his senses. Then he felt it, a faint tugging at the edges of his awareness, as if someone were gently calling his name from a great distance. Not a sound, but a presence, familiar yet strange. Echo 1 turned to look at him, and in that moment, James understood. There were others, other animals, other humans who had been part of the program, scattered across the country but still connected through whatever inexplicable bond the experiments had created, and somehow, through Echo 1, James could sense them too. "They're out there," James murmured. "Others like us." The horse bobbed his head in what seemed unmistakably like affirmation. James felt a surge of hope. They weren't alone in this. If there were others, perhaps they had answers, perhaps they could help against Carlson's team. The sound of a vehicle engine, much closer than before, snapped James back to their immediate situation. Echo 1 tensed, ears flattening slightly in warning. They'd lingered too long in one place. It was time to move. James quickly packed his supplies, making sure to secure his father's USB drive and journal. As he prepared to leave, he noticed something he'd overlooked in the footlocker, a tattered envelope addressed simply to the finder. Inside was a hand-drawn map of the mountain region, with several locations marked, and a cryptic note in his father's handwriting. "When the time comes, these sanctuaries will offer protection. The network remains active. Trust the connection." One of the marked locations was only a few miles from their current position, labeled Rendezvous Point Alpha. James studied the route, memorizing the key landmarks before carefully folding the map and tucking it into his pocket. "Ready?" he asked Echo 1, who was already poised at the cave entrance, seemingly eager to depart. They emerged into the crisp morning air, keeping to the shadows as they navigated away from the approaching vehicle sounds. The steep terrain made travel difficult for James, but Echo 1 moved with confidence, finding paths that offered both concealment and efficiency. The bond between them continued to strengthen. James found himself anticipating the horse's movements, understanding his warnings without verbal cues, as if some part of his consciousness had expanded to include Echo 1's sensory input. By mid-morning, they had covered significant ground, climbing to a higher elevation that gave them a vantage point over the valleys below. From this position, James could see the government team's operation had expanded considerably. Multiple vehicles now combed the lower slopes, and 2 helicopters circled in a coordinated search pattern. "They're throwing everything at this," James muttered. "Whatever my father discovered, they're desperate to keep it contained." Echo 1 nudged him forward, clearly wanting to continue toward their destination. As they traveled, James continued processing everything he'd learned. The Mountain Echo program had stumbled onto something that transcended conventional understanding of consciousness, a connection between minds that defied current scientific paradigms. No wonder Carlson was determined to suppress it. If consciousness could extend beyond individual brains, if it could connect across species and potentially across generations, the implications for human society would be revolutionary. They paused briefly at a stream to drink and rest. James sat on a rock, watching Echo 1 graze nearby, reflecting on how his life had changed in just 2 days. From a solitary veteran fighting his personal demons to a man on the run, carrying secrets that could potentially change humanity's understanding of itself. "Dad," he said quietly, "what did you get me into?" Echo 1 raised his head and looked directly at James, and in that moment, James felt a wave of emotion that wasn't entirely his own. Determination, purpose, and something that felt remarkably like pride. Whether it came from the horse or was some echo of his father's consciousness preserved in their shared bond, James couldn't say. But it strengthened his resolve to see this through, to understand the full truth of what his father had discovered. By early afternoon, James and Echo 1 had reached the vicinity of Rendezvous Point Alpha. According to his father's map, it was located in a small valley nestled between 2 ridge lines, accessible only through a narrow pass. As they approached, James noticed Echo 1's behavior changing. The horse moved with increased alertness, ears constantly pivoting, nostrils flaring as if detecting scents beyond James's perception. "We're close, aren't we?" James murmured. "You've been here before." The horse quickened his pace, leading James down a barely visible game trail that wound through dense pine forest. The trees eventually thinned, revealing a secluded meadow surrounded by steep cliffs on three sides. A small cabin stood near the western edge, smoke rising from its chimney. Several horses grazed nearby, lifting their heads in unison as Echo One and James emerged from the trees. James tensed, scanning the area for potential threats, but Echo One showed no signs of concern. If anything, the white horse seemed eager to approach, nickering softly toward the other animals. James noticed something unusual about the gathered horses. Each bore distinctive markings or colorations that made them immediately identifiable, almost as if they had been deliberately selected for their unique appearances. The cabin door opened, and a woman stepped out. She was in her 60s, with silver hair pulled back in a practical braid and the weathered complexion of someone who had spent decades outdoors. She wore simple hiking clothes and carried no visible weapons, but her posture suggested military training, balanced, alert, assessing. She spotted James immediately but seemed more interested in Echo One. Her expression shifted from cautious to astonished as she recognized the white horse. "Echo One," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the meadow. "After all these years." James remained where he was, uncertain. The woman made no aggressive moves but simply watched as Echo One approached her. When the horse reached her, she placed her hand gently on his neck, closing her eyes briefly as if communing with him. "You must be Michael's son," she said finally, looking up at James. "He always said you'd find your way here eventually." "Who are you?" James called, still maintaining his distance. "Lieutenant Colonel Catherine Hayes, retired, U.S. Army Special Operations, though that was a very long time ago." She gestured toward the cabin. "You should come inside. We have a lot to talk about, and it's not safe to linger in the open. Carlson's team has better surveillance than they did in your father's day." James hesitated, weighing his options. Echo One clearly trusted this woman, but years in combat zones had taught him caution. "How did you know my father?" Hayes smiled slightly. "We were in the program together. Echo Group 1969. Your father was paired with Echo One. I was paired with Sierra 3. She nodded toward a dappled gray mare grazing nearby. "Different animals, same connection. We've been monitoring the old training site since Michael passed. When the ammunition box was disturbed, we knew someone had found it." That explained the quick response from Carlson's team. They'd been alerted by Hayes or someone in her network. "Are you working with them?" James asked, gesturing vaguely toward the valleys where the government search continued. Hayes's expression hardened. "Absolutely not. We've been hiding from Carlson for decades. He believes the program should remain buried, the knowledge contained. We believe otherwise." She turned toward the cabin. "Please come inside, the others are waiting." Others. So there were more participants from the original program. James felt Echo One nudging him forward, the horse's calm presence reassuring him that Hayes could be trusted. With a deep breath, he followed her toward the cabin. Inside, 3 people sat around a rustic wooden table looking up as James entered. Hayes made brief introductions. Martin Chen, a man in his 70s who had been part of the original research team. David Reese, about James's age, whose father had been a program participant. And Eliza Torres, a neurologist who had independently researched similar phenomena before finding their group. "Welcome to Sanctuary," Hayes said, gesturing for James to sit. One of several safe locations established by program participants after the official termination. "How many of you are there?" James asked, taking in the cabin's interior. It was sparsely furnished but well equipped with modern communications equipment nestled alongside vintage furniture. "From the original program? Just a handful now," Chen replied, his voice carrying a slight accent. Most have passed on, but their children, like you and David, often inherit the connection. And sometimes we find others who have developed similar abilities naturally. James absorbed this information, trying to reconcile it with everything he'd learned. And the horses? Echo 1 should be over 50 years old. How is that possible? The group exchanged glances before Hayes answered. We don't fully understand it ourselves. The program animals all showed drastically reduced aging. Some scientists theorized it was a side effect of the neural synchronization, that human consciousness somehow affected their biological processes. Others believed the animals themselves were special to begin with, possessing some quality that made them receptive to the connection. Your father had his own theory, Chen added. He believed consciousness itself exists independent of physical form, that what we perceive as separate beings are actually expressions of a unified awareness. The bonding process simply made that underlying connection accessible to conscious perception. That sounds more like philosophy than science, James said skeptically. Chen smiled. The line between them blurs at the frontiers of knowledge. Quantum physics already suggests observer effects and entanglement across distances. What we experienced in the program pushed those boundaries further. Torres, the neurologist, leaned forward. I've been studying brainwave patterns in bonded pairs. The synchronization is measurable, reproducible, and defies conventional explanations. It's as if their neural networks become quantum entangled, operating in coherence despite physical separation. Which is exactly why Carlson and his superiors want this buried, Hayes interjected. The implications threaten too many power structures, too many assumptions about consciousness and control. James thought about the files he'd discovered, the hints of his father's research. So what happens now? Carlson's team is tearing apart the mountains looking for us. Us, Hayes repeated, with a slight smile. Already thinking of yourself and Echo 1 as a unit. The connection forms quickly when it's inherited. James realized she was right. Somewhere in the past 2 days, he had stopped thinking of the white horse as separate from himself. Echo 1 had become an extension of his awareness, a presence in his mind that felt natural, even necessary. Your father prepared for this moment, Hayes continued. He left evidence scattered across multiple locations, insurance against Carlson's attempts to erase what we discovered. The ammunition box was just the beginning, a breadcrumb trail leading to the complete archive. Which is what exactly? James asked. Everything, Chen replied simply. Research data, participant testimonies, scientific analyses, enough evidence to prove the reality of what we experienced. Evidence that consciousness extends beyond the individual, beyond species barriers, beyond the materialist paradigm that underpins current power structures. And my father believed making this public was worth the risk? Hayes nodded solemnly. He believed humanity deserved to know the truth about its own potential, that the knowledge could transform our relationship with each other and with the natural world. But first, Reese added, speaking for the first time, we need to recover the final piece of the archive before Carlson does. And that's where you and Echo 1 come in. James leaned forward, elbows on the table. What final piece? And why me specifically? Hayes exchanged glances with Chen before answering. Your father created a fail-safe, a complete backup of all program data and his personal research, stored in a location that can only be accessed through the bond. What does that mean? James asked. It means, Chen explained, that Michael encoded the location in Echo 1's consciousness, not as explicit coordinates, but as a memory pattern that would activate fully only when Echo 1 reconnected with Michael's bloodline. That's... James struggled to find words. That shouldn't be possible. Torres shook her head. Based on conventional neuroscience, you're right. But the bond creates neural pathways that operate differently. Think of it as a form of distributed consciousness. Information stored across two minds requiring both to access it completely. James considered this. So Echo One knows where this archive is, but can't consciously access the knowledge unless I'm connected to him? Precisely, Hayes confirmed. Your father designed it that way to ensure Carlson could never extract the information, even if he recaptured Echo One. The location would remain dormant unless the right neural signature, yours, activated it. And has the location activated? James asked, still struggling with the concept. We believe it's beginning to, Hayes said. That's why Echo One sought you out specifically, led you to the abandoned farm, to the hidden tunnel. The memories are surfacing gradually as your bond strengthens. James thought about the pull he'd felt toward certain locations since meeting Echo One, the inexplicable certainty about which paths to take. It hadn't felt like following an external guide, but more like remembering places he'd never actually been. How much time do we have, he asked, before Carlson's team finds us? Not much, Reese answered grimly. They've called in additional resources, thermal imaging drones, signal intelligence. This sanctuary location is shielded against most surveillance, but we can't stay long. Hayes nodded in agreement. We need to move tonight. The final archive location is somewhere in these mountains, and you and Echo One are the key to finding it. And once we have it, James asked. We implement your father's distribution protocol, Chen replied. Simultaneous release to scientific journals, media outlets, and secure internet platforms worldwide. Too dispersed for any single government to suppress. Won't that put a target on all our backs? Hayes smiled grimly. We've lived with targets on our backs for decades. The difference is, once the information is public, eliminating us won't contain it anymore. James wasn't entirely convinced, but he understood the stakes. His father had devoted his life to this cause, had prepared meticulously for this moment, and somewhere deep inside, James felt the rightness of it, a conviction that humanity deserved to know the truth about consciousness and its potential. What do I need to do? He asked finally. Deepen your connection with Echo One, Torres explained. The stronger the bond, the clearer the location will become to both of you. And how exactly do I do that? The same way your father did, Hayes said, rising from her chair. Through shared experience, through trust, through surrendering the boundaries between your consciousness and his. We'll help guide you through the process. They spent the next few hours preparing for departure. Hayes and her team gathered supplies, communications equipment, and what looked like scientific instruments for documenting their findings. Meanwhile, Torres worked with James and Echo One outside the cabin, guiding them through exercises designed to strengthen their neural synchronization. Close your eyes, Torres instructed James as he sat beside Echo One in the meadow. Focus on your breathing first, then gradually extend your awareness toward Echo One. Don't try to direct the connection, just open yourself to it. James followed her guidance, skeptical at first, but soon finding himself slipping into an altered state of consciousness. With each breath, the boundary between himself and Echo One seemed to blur. He began to perceive sensory impressions that weren't his own, the feeling of 4 hooves on the earth instead of 2 feet, the different quality of vision, the heightened sense of smell that could detect water sources and predators from great distances. That's it, Torres encouraged softly. Now, without opening your eyes, tell me what Echo One is seeing. James remained silent for a moment, allowing the shared perception to clarify. The northern ridge line, he said finally. There's a hawk circling above the pine forest. Torres made a small sound of satisfaction. Excellent. And now? He's looking at you, at the notebook in your hand. The pen has a blue cap. And the other horses? What are they doing? James focused again, feeling Echo One's awareness shift. The dappled gray Sierra 3 is watching us. The others are grazing, but they're alert, oriented toward the South Valley, They sense something approaching. James's eyes snapped open as the shared perception triggered an alarm response. Echo 1 was already turning toward the southern edge of the meadow, ears pricked forward, muscles tensing. "We've got company," James said, rising quickly to his feet. Hayes emerged from the cabin, alerted by their change in posture. "How far?" "A few miles, but moving fast," James replied, surprised at his own certainty. "Vehicles on the lower road," and he paused, concentrating on the sensory input from Echo 1. "A helicopter just beyond the ridge." Reese emerged with a pair of binoculars, scanning the southern approach. "Confirmed. Looks like they've triangulated our position." "We need to move," Hayes decided. "Now, before they have us surrounded." Within minutes, the team had packed essential equipment onto the horses. James was impressed by their efficiency. Clearly, they had prepared for rapid evacuation many times before. Echo 1 stood calmly as James secured his pack and his father's materials. "Where are we headed?" James asked as they prepared to depart. "North, through the high pass," Hayes replied, mounting Sierra 3 with the ease of long practice. "After that, you and Echo 1 will need to guide us. The archive location is locked in your shared consciousness. We can't find it without you." As they rode away from the cabin, James felt a strange doubling of perception. He was simultaneously aware of his own body and Echo 1's, experiencing the landscape through both human and equine senses. The sensation was disorienting at first, but gradually became natural, even advantageous. He could detect subtle changes in air pressure that suggested weather patterns, sense ground vibrations that indicated distant vehicle movements, and navigate using landmarks that resonated with Echo 1's spatial memory. They climbed steadily through dense forest, following game trails too narrow for vehicles to pursue. The horses moved with confidence despite the difficult terrain, communicating with each other through subtle body language that James could now partially interpret through his connection with Echo 1. As they reached a high ridgeline overlooking a vast expanse of wilderness, something shifted in James's perception. A new awareness bloomed in his mind, not his own memory, not quite Echo 1's, but something shared between them that contained knowledge neither possessed individually. "I know where it is," James said suddenly, the certainty absolute. "The archive. I can see it." Hayes reined Sierra 3 to a halt beside him. "Where?" James pointed toward a distant formation of rocky spires jutting from the forest. "There, in the heart of Devil's Crown. There's a cavern system that doesn't appear on any maps. My father discovered it during his training here, kept it secret even from the program administrators." "That's 6 hours ride minimum," Reese observed. "Carlson's team will be right behind us." "Then we'd better keep moving," Hayes said grimly, "and hope the weather turns in our favor." As if in answer, clouds began gathering on the horizon, dark and heavy with the promise of rain, weather that would hamper aerial surveillance and potentially mask their heat signatures from thermal imaging. James couldn't help but wonder if this too was somehow connected to the expanded consciousness they were accessing, a deeper attunement to natural patterns that bordered on what some might call intuition or even precognition. The storm broke as they descended into the valley below Devil's Crown, sheets of rain reducing visibility to mere yards. Lightning illuminated the jagged rock formations in brief electric flashes, revealing a landscape both beautiful and forbidding. The horses navigated the treacherous terrain with remarkable confidence, communicating with each other through subtle shifts in posture and movement that James could now partially perceive through his deepening bond with Echo 1. "How much further?" Hayes called over the downpour, water streaming from the brim of her hat. James pointed toward a nearly invisible cleft in the rock face ahead. "There. The entrance is hidden behind that stand of pines." As they approached, James felt a strange doubling of memory, his own present perception overlaid with what seemed like Echo 1's past experiences of this place. The sensation was disorienting but illuminating, providing insights about the hidden entrance that neither of them could have possessed individually. "The passage narrows about 50 feet in," James said, dismounting as they reached the concealed opening. "We'll need to continue on foot." Chen handed out waterproof headlamps from his pack. "What about the horses?" "There's a sheltered hollow just east of here," James replied, the knowledge surfacing unbidden from the shared consciousness. "They'll be protected from the storm and hidden from aerial surveillance." Hayes nodded, impressed by the specificity of the information. "The bond is strengthening rapidly. Michael would be proud." The horses were led to the protected hollow, where they settled with remarkable calmness despite the storm raging around them. Echo 1 remained close to James, however, unwilling to be separated as they prepared to enter the cavern. "He needs to come with us," James stated, knowing somehow that Echo 1's presence was essential for what lay ahead. Hayes looked skeptical. "The passage is narrow." "He'll manage," James interrupted with unexpected certainty. "He's done it before." Without waiting for further discussion, James led Echo 1 toward the hidden entrance, ducking beneath low-hanging pine branches to reveal a crevice in the rock face. The opening was indeed narrow, but Echo 1 navigated it with practiced ease, his white coat gleaming in the beam of James's headlamp as they descended into the earth. The others followed, their footsteps echoing in the confined space. The initial passage gradually widened into a larger tunnel, reinforced with old timber supports similar to those in the command post James had discovered earlier. Military engineering, precise and efficient, creating a hidden facility beneath the mountain surface. "Your father found this place during an escape and evasion exercise in '69, Hayes explained as they walked deeper into the mountain. "The program administrators never knew about it. It became his personal sanctuary and later the repository for everything he discovered." The tunnel eventually opened into a large cavern, its ceiling disappearing into darkness above the reach of their headlamps. At the center stood a structure that seemed out of place in the subterranean setting, a small, weatherproof shed constructed of modern materials, secured with a combination lock. "The archive," Chen whispered reverently. James approached the shed, Echo 1 at his side. He reached for the lock, then hesitated, uncertain of the combination. "Your father would have chosen something you'd remember," Hayes suggested. James thought for a moment, then smiled sadly. "My birthday, eh?" He never forgot, even when deployed. The lock opened with a click when he entered the date. Inside, the shed contained a sophisticated storage system, climate-controlled cases housing physical documents, hard drives sealed in waterproof containers, and what appeared to be biological samples preserved in specialized units. "It's all here," Torres said, examining the contents with obvious excitement. Decades of research, empirical evidence of consciousness extending beyond conventional boundaries. Reese had set up a portable satellite communication system near the entrance. "We should start the upload immediately. Carlson's team has reached the sanctuary cabin. They'll figure out our heading soon enough." James helped them connect the hard drives to their equipment, beginning the process of uploading the archive to secure servers worldwide. As the data transfer commenced, he turned his attention to a sealed envelope addressed to him in his father's handwriting, placed prominently atop the main console. Inside was a letter, dated just weeks before Michael Harmon's death. "James, if you're reading this, then what I always believed has come to pass. Echo 1 found you, and the bond that was once mine has passed to you. I'm sorry for the burden this places on your shoulders, but also grateful that you'll finally understand the truth I could never fully explain in life. What we discovered through the Mountain Echo program wasn't just a method of communication or a tactical advantage. It was a glimpse into the true nature of consciousness itself. We are not isolated minds trapped in separate bodies, but expressions of a connected awareness that transcends physical limitations." Echo 1 is unique among the program animals. The scientists could never explain his longevity or the depth of his connection. Some called it a mutation, others a fluke of neurochemistry. I came to understand it as something simpler and more profound. He embodies a consciousness that exists beyond time as we perceive it. The bond you now share isn't just between you and Echo 1. It's a connection to something greater, something that includes but transcends both of you. In that connection, I remain present as well, not as a ghost or spirit, but as part of the expanded consciousness you now access. Humanity stands at a crossroads. We can continue to perceive ourselves as separate from each other and from the natural world, or we can awaken to the deeper reality of our interconnection. The choice brings responsibility, which is why I've entrusted this knowledge to you rather than letting it remain in government hands. Whatever happens after you release this information, know that I am proud of the man you've become. Trust the bond, trust yourself, and remember that consciousness, like love, is not diminished when shared but multiplied. Dad. James folded the letter carefully, a sense of peace washing over him despite the danger they still faced. Through his connection with Echo 1, he could feel his father's presence, not as a supernatural entity but as a pattern within their shared consciousness, memories and experiences preserved in the neural connections they had all formed. Upload at 60%, Reese reported. But we've got company. Thermal signatures approaching from the south. Hayes checked her weapon. How long to complete? 15 minutes minimum, Torres replied, monitoring the data transfer. Then we hold them off for 15 minutes, Hayes said grimly. Defensive positions at the entrance. As the team prepared to defend their position, a strange calm settled over James. He placed his hand on Echo 1's neck, feeling the steady pulse beneath the white coat, and closed his eyes. Through their shared perception, he sensed not just the approaching team, but the entire mountain around them, the pathways through the cavern system, the weaknesses in the rock structure, the subtle flows of air and water. There's another way, he said suddenly, opening his eyes. We don't need to fight them. Hayes looked at him questioningly. Echo 1 knows this mountain from the inside out, James explained. There's an underwater passage that connects to the northern valley. If we collapse the main entrance, Carlson's team will be delayed long enough for the upload to complete, and we can escape through the alternative route. Chen nodded appreciatively. Michael would have planned for this. He never left anything to chance. Working quickly, they rigged the support beams near the entrance with the small amount of explosives Hayes had brought as a last resort. As Carlson's team approached the outer passage, they detonated the charges, sending a controlled avalanche of rock across the main entrance. The upload completed just as they navigated the underwater passage, emerging into the northern valley where the storm was beginning to clear. Above them, stars appeared between breaking clouds, and in the distance, the first hint of dawn illuminated the eastern horizon. James stood beside Echo 1 on a rise overlooking the vast wilderness, feeling a profound sense of connection, not just to the white horse beside him, but to his father's legacy, to the land itself, and to the expanded understanding of consciousness they had fought to preserve. What now? He asked Hayes as the others joined them. She smiled, looking out at the breaking dawn. Now the world changes. Not overnight, but gradually, as people begin to understand what your father discovered, that the boundaries we perceive between minds, between species, between past and present, are more permeable than we ever imagined. Echo 1 nudged James gently, and in that moment James understood that their journey was just beginning. The white horse had found him for a purpose that extended beyond recovering the archive. Together they would become living proof of what the documents could only describe, the reality of consciousness that transcends the limitations of a single mind, a single lifetime, a single species. As the sun crested the distant mountains, James mounted Echo 1, and they rode toward the dawn, guardians of a truth that would forever change humanity's understanding of itself and its place in the living world.